In the heart of winter, the hospital's gray walls seemed to merge with the soon clouds overhead, as if the building itself was absorbing the bleakness of the season. I had started my residency in pediatric just as the first snow blanketed the city, and from my very first night, the hospital felt to live with whispered secrets and unexplained shadows that flickered just beyond the reach of the flickering fluorescent lights. I was assigned the night shift, which suited me just fine. The quiet of the darkened wards allowed me to think, to focus on the peculiar medical puzzles that often presented themselves in the early hours. But those puzzles weren't confined to ailments and diagnostics. Some were deeply unsettling, rooted in the hospital's disturbing past. My first encounter with something inexplicable happened on a night cloaked in fog, the kind that muffles sound and makes the world seem the real. I was making my rounds, the soles of my shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. Most of the children were asleep, their soft breathing age at la chorus in the dim light. As I passed room 407, a chill slithered down my spine. The door, which I knew had been closed tightly, stood ajar. Inside, the room was bathed in an unnaturality blue light. Curiosity became my hesitation, and I pushed the door open. The room was empty, its small bed neatly made no sign of occupancy. Yet there in the corner stood a figure, a boy staring out the window with his back to me. He was translucent, most of their ill. And though I knew no child had been admitted into that room, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if he were as real as any flesh and blood child. "Hello," my voice was a whisper, half hoping he wouldn't respond. He turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "She doesn't like the light," he said, his voice is embodied that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then he vanished, leaving me alone with the pulsing hum of the overhead lights shaking. I reported the incident to the head nurse, an older woman named Marguerite with deep-set eyes and a no-nonsense manners. She listened quietly, then sighed, a sound heavy with unspoken knowledge. "That's Tommy," she finally said. "He used to be a patient there long ago. Died of tuberculosis in the 50s. This hospital, it keeps some souls." I wanted to dismiss her words, attribute everything to fatigue or attrick of the light, but Tommy's presence had felt too real. His warning to Argent, as the nights wore on, the encounters grew more frequent. Doors would open and close of their own. Bored, the sound of distant crying echoed down the empty corridors, and once a chilling scream shattered the silence of the early morning hours, only to be cut off abruptly, leaving a suffocating stillness. One night, while reviewing patient files in the dim light of the nurse station, the air turned icy cold, the lights flickered and died, plunging the whole way into darkness. The backup generator should have kicked in, but it remained silent in the blackness. A soft sing-song voice whispered right beside my ear, "She's watching you." I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing, only the oppressive dark and a sense of being watched from the shadows. The light flickered back to life, revealing the empty hallway, but the feeling of being observed didn't fade. The next few weeks were a blur of unexplainable events. I found myself drawn to the hospital's records, to the dusty files stored in the basement. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered about the hospital's grim history: unmarked graves in the old hospital cemetery, experimental treatments from decades past, and numerous patients who vanished without a trace. My obsession grew. The hospital's past began to consume each piece of the puzzle, only serving to deepen the mystery. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I found a worn leather-bound journal belonging to a doctor who had worked at the hospital in the early 1900s. His entries were erratic, filled with frantic scribbles about a patient, a young woman named Eliza, who he claimed was possessed by something dark, something ancient. The last entry was a hastily scrawled warning: "Do not let her out, she must remain in the shadows. The light only anchors her." I shivered, remembering Tommy's words, "She doesn't like the light." Determined to understand, I ventured deeper into the hospital's abandonment. That night, the air grew colder. With each step, the silence oppressive. My flashlight flickered as I approached room 113, the room where Eliza had been kept according to the old maps. The door creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in shadows. My light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. A figure stood by the window, her back to me, her hair long and unsaid. "Eliza," my voice trembled, breaking the stillness. She turned slowly, her face obscured by shadows. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice a chilling caress. "Now she knows about you." Before I could respond, the light surged blindingly bright, and then shattered, plunging the room into an abyss of darkness. A cold hand gripped my shoulder, its touch paralyzing. "You are Minna now," a voice hiss said in the dark, filled with malevolent glee. Panic set in, but before I could react, the floor seemed to open beneath me, pulling me down into an endless void. I screamed, the sound echoing around me. It fell deeper into the darkness when I awoke. I was in the hospital bed, the morning light streaming through the window. It was all a dream. Told myself a nightmare induced by too many nights spent wandering the haunted corridors of this old hospital. But as eyes lit up, I noticed something clenched in my hand, a piece of old tattered hospital gown. The fabric cold and damp, and somewhere distant yet distinct a voice whispered, "Welcome to the night shift." Fabric in my hand was a grim token that the horrors I'd experienced were no more dreams. Clutching the tattered gown, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my mind racing with the implications of what had occurred. The hospital around me seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The air was thick, oppressive, as if it were trying to smother me in its embrace. As I wandered the halls, the fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for me. As I passed, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional distant sound of a door slamming shut, as if the hospital itself were rearranging its layout, trapping me inside its twisted corridors. I made my way towards the nurse station, desperate for some sign of normality, but as I approached, eyes where the figure of a woman, her back to me, standing motionless at the counter. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. The fabric stained and tattered, her hair was pulled back tightly, but strands escaped wild and unkempt. "Can you help me?" I called out tentatively. Slowly, she turned, her movements unnaturally smooth. Her face was pale, almost translucent, eyes hollow and black like void. Her lips curled into a smile, but it was devoid of warmth. Dammer contraction of skin and muscle. "There's no help for you here," she whispered, her voice echoing as if coming from a deep well. "You're part of the hospital now." With a shudder, I backed, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. The lights along the corridor dimmed one by one, as if a shadow were sweeping through, engulfing the light. Panic gripped me, and I ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. I didn't know where I was going. The layout seemed to have shifted, corridors twisting into unfamiliar configurations. Doors I had passed countless times were now gone, replaced by blank walls or new passageways that led to chilling, empty rooms. As I pushed through a set of double doors, enter what appeared to be an old operating theater. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that swung gently from the ceiling. The air was cooler here, the scent of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, blood, perhaps, hung heavy in the center of the rooms. To an operating table, its straps frayed and stained. I approached slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. That's when I saw them, figure standing around the table, dressed in surgical gowns that were smeared with dark stains. They were motionless, their faces obscured by surgical masks. And as I watched, they turned towards me, head tilting in unison. "You shouldn't be here," one murmured. The voice muffled by the mask. "We need to fix you," another said, stepping forward, a rusted surgical tool gleaming in his hand. I backed away, stumbling over a loose floor tile. Figures advanced, their movements jerky like marionettes being pulled by unseen strings. Desperation surged through me, and it turned and ran, barely noticing as the room behind me seemed to dissolve into darkness. The doors slamming shut with a sound like thunder, breathless and disoriented. I found myself in a pediatric ward. The room was filled with rows of empty beds, their sheets neatly folded, toys lay scattered on the floor, untouched, and gathering dust. A cold breeze whispered through the room, carrying with it the faint sound of children laughing. Turning towards the sound, I saw where a little girl, no more than 7, sit and cross-legged in the middle of the floor. Her hair was bright red, her eyes a piercing blue that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She was playing with a set of fold wooden blocks, spelling out words I couldn't understand. "Do you want to play with me?" she asked, her voice light and airy, as if she were inviting me to a harmless game. "What are you playing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Heidi and Zeke," she replied, standing up. "You Heidi and she Zeke's? Who's Zeke's?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "The nurses," she whispered, pointing behind me. I spun around hard in my throat, but there was noon, or just the lingering sense of being watched. When I turned back, the girl was gone, the blocks scattered as if she'd never been there, it all confused and terrified. I continued through the hospital, each step taking me deeper into its nightmarish embrace. The walls seemed to pulse with a sinister rhythm, and faint whispers filled the air, words slipping just beyond my grasp. Suddenly a loud bang echoed through the halls, followed by a series of thumps, as if something or someone was being dragged. I followed the sound, my body tense, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The noise led me to the morgue, the door ajar, light flickering from within. As stepped inside, the temperature dropped, breath visible in the air. The morgue was lined with metal drawers, all closed, but one from inside. Pale hand dangled, limp and lifeless. "Help me," a voice moaned, weak and desperate. As I approached, the drawers slowly opened further, revealing the face of a man, his skin ashen, eyes clouded over. He looked at me, pleading, "Please don't let Leather find me," who I managed to ask, though I dreaded the answer. "The one who walks the halls," she whispered, "the one who never leaves." I reached out to help him, but before our hands could touch the lights, went out, plunging into darkness. A cold wind swept through the room, and I heard the drawers slam shut. "Run!" the man's voices screamed from within the metal coffin. The darkness seemed to swirl around me, tangible force pulling at my clothes, my hair. I ran through the drawers, slamming, reverberating in my ears. The man's final scream, a ghostly whisper in the wind. The corridor seemed endless, a labyrinth designed not merely to confuse but to terrify. The darkness clung to the walls like a living thing, shifting and pulsating with an unforeseen heartbeat. Each turn seemed to only lead further into the bowels of the hospital, where the air grew colder and the faint whispers turned to groans of despair. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of the horrors I'd encountered, each more terrifying than the last. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was an eternal house where the barrier between life and death was perilously thin. As I turned a corner, I stumbled into a small chapel room I hadn't noticed in my previous wanderings. Inside, the pews were dusty, the altar cloth moth-eaten, but despite the decay, the room felt safer, somehow as if the evil that permeated the rest of the building was reluctant to enter this sanctified space. I collapsed into a pew, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence, said silence, then a soft melodic voice filled the room, echoing off the stained glass windows. "Lost, dare you?" I looked up to see a figure standing at the altar, shrouded in a light seemed impossible, given the lack of electricity in the building. Figure was cloaked, face hidden beneath a hood, but the voice was unmistakably female, jet lead with an ineffable sadness. Yes, I admitted, my voice a mere whisper. "I don't understand this place. What is happening here?" The figure stepped forward, the light surrounding her pulsating gently. "This hospital," she began, her voice resonating with a sorrowful melody, "is a nexus. Lace where the veils between worlds are thin. Many have suffered here. Their pain and despair have soaked into the walls. But why am I here? Why am I seeing these things? You were called here." She replied cryptically, "Your spirit resonates with this place. You have a gift, though it may not seem such. You see what others cannot." A chill ran through me. How do I leave? I asked, desperate to leave. "You must first understand what holds you here. You must face the darkness, not run from it." Her words felt like a sentence, a doom pronounced with the finality of a closing coffin lid. The light around her brightened, compelling me to close my eyes. When I opened them again, she was gone, the room once more shrouded in gloom. Pulling myself to my feet, I left the chapel, a new determination settling over me. Facing the darkness was the only way out. Then I would meet it. The dawn. The hospital seemed to sense my resolve, the atmosphere shifting, becoming charged with a malevolent energy. Shadows moved just out of the corner of my eye. Whispers filled my ears, a cacophony of voices begging, threatening, crying. I found myself drawn to the oldest part of the hospital, the foundation upon which the modern structure had been built. There the air was thick with the stench of decay, the walls stained with the patina of age and suffering. As I walked, my flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to penetrate the oppressive darkness. Then ahead, as a wood door, old and wooden with iron fittings, though it looked centuries old, it stood slightly ajar, as liver of darkness beckoning. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, the ceilings lost in shadows, chains shung from the walls, and old rusted medical equipment littered the floor in the central arch. Stone tables stood stained with what I could only assume was blood, ancient and dried. The air was colder here, a chill that seeped into my bones. I felt eyes upon me, watching from every shadow, then a sound, alone, moaning. that grew into a cacophonous wail filled the room. Figures materialized around me, their forms spectral and twisted by pain. They circled the table, their eyes hollow, their mouth agape in silent screams. And there on the table lay a body, or what was left of one. It was decayed, nearly skeletal, but dressed in the remnants of what looked like a doctor's coat. As I watched, frozen in terror, the figures began to chant in a language I did not understand, their voices rising and falling in a horrific cadence. The body on the table stirred, its movements jerky, as if it were being puppeteered by the ghastly congregation. "You must understand," a voice echoed strong and clear above the Denny. Was the woman from the chapter, figure now standing at the head of the table. "Understand and release the body," Setupached, turning towards me, glowing with an unholy light. "Help us," it speed the voice, a hollow sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. I stepped forward, my fear battling with a growing sense of purpose. "What must I do?" I asked, my voice steady. "Free us," the woman said, her hands gesturing to the chains on the walls. "Break the chains of pain and suffering. Release the spirits bound here." My heart pounded as I approached the table, spectral figures starting to allow me passage. Each step felt like an eternity, the weight of their gazes a tangible pressure against my skin. As I reached the table, the body lay back down, as if submitting to some unspoken command. I placed my hands on it, the flesh cold and clammy. Chanting increased, a sound that filled the room vibrate. A ting through my very soul, the chanting crescendoed around me, the ancient language vibrating through the cold stone beneath my feet. Each syllable seemed to pulse with the collected anguish of centuries, the pain of the bound souls forming a palpable haze in the air. I could feel the energy from the body beneath my hands begin to rise, a cold fire that seared without heat. My mind was flooded with images, flashes of lives lived in agony of unending torment endured. Within these walls, each vision was more harrowing than the last, a relentless barrage that threatened to overwhelm my senses. Focused, the woman's voice commanded through the den. Her figure was a beacon in the dark, her light a shield against the darkness that thrashed against. Release them. Gathering every shred of courage, I pressed my hands firmer against the decaying fabric of the doctor's coat, the fabric crumbling beneath my touch. The spectral figures around me began to change, their twisted features smoothing the agony in their expressions, giving way to a cautious hope. The room began to shake, stones from the crumbling walls falling, the very foundation of death. A hospital groaning under the strain of the ritual. The body under my hands started to dissolve, the decayed flesh turning to dust, floating away in a wind that had risen from nowhere. The chains on the walls rattled violently, and one by one snapped with loud resounding clanks. As each chain broke, a figure would vanish, their form dissipating into the air with a sigh of relief, so profound it was almost palpable. Freeing them, the woman called out to me with a roar, "Just a little more." I closed my eyes, channeling every ounce of willpower. The room spun around me, a stone table against my palms. Another chain broke, another soul released, their departure marked by a light that flickered and then went out as the last chain fell away. The room suddenly stilled, the air clearing, as if a storm had passed slowly. I opened my eyes, the room was empty, the table on the walls no longer decrepit, but somehow new, as if reborn. The woman was still there, her light now soft and warm. "You've done it," he said, her voice no longer echoing from the beyond, but as real and solid. "Ask the ground beneath my feet, what will happen now?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the ordeal. "Now the healing begins, for the man, for you." She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch my forehead. Her fingers were warm, and as they brushed my skin, a sense of peace flooded through me, washing away the terror and confusion. The hospital around us seemed to bring breath, a sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifting, replaced by something lighter, cleaner. The light from the woman brightened, enveloping us both, and when it finally dimmed, I found myself standing outside the hospital, the sun rising on a new day. The building looked different. Now the walls clean and inviting, the windows clear and bright. People moved in and out, but there was no sense of the malevolent energy that had pervaded it before. "For you're free to go," the woman said, her job done, her presence no longer tethered to the darkness. "But remember, not all places are meant to hold so much suffering. You have a gift, use it." With that, she faded away, her form dissolving into the morning light. I stood there for a moment, taking in deep breaths of the fresh air, feeling lighter and hiding what felt like an eternity. Running away from the hospital, I walked towards the life I had left behind. The horror of the night, something I would carry with me, but as a reminder of the strength I had found, not of the darkness that had tried to consume me. I walked. The sun climbed higher, its rays warm on my back, promising a day full of life, of possibilities behind. The hospital stood silent, a sentinel that had seen the worst of humanity, but had emerged like mere eddy to begin anew.